So welcome everybody to yet another conversation of Architecture Talk Tank with Sarah Colata. I have Jose Cruz from Integrated Projects with me today, yet again, for a wonderful conversation about strategic planning. The other day when we met and we had a conversation with Jose, he's been telling me a lot about how he's positioned his company, and I found it really interesting. I really wanted him to share some of these experiences. So I asked him to come back on a conversation with me, and so that we can cover just in this conversation here only the subject of strategic positioning. But going back to the basics, I will let you introduce yourself, Jose, and tell a little bit about what you do, just in case the listeners haven't seen the first part of our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. Jose Cruz, I'm the founder, managing director of Integrated Projects. We're a building intelligence company based out of New York and doing work all over, partnering with organizations, private and public, to digitally transform their real estate portfolios. So
Excellent. Thank you and welcome back. So yeah, it's been very, very interesting for me to have this conversation with you offline the other day about ways in which you basically positioned your company, and I wanted to pick your brains about this and find out a little bit more. So can you tell me, maybe let's just start from the basic, what is strategic positioning and why is it important in the first place?
Yeah, super important. So the way that I define strategic positioning is probably helpful to understand how I would see strategy itself. And strategy is very much about trade-offs, sometimes understanding more what you don't do than what you do. And what I've noticed is that once myself, my team, the company, once we're very clear on what we don't do, then we can actually start asking ourselves what we have the opportunity to be the best in the world at something. And but it starts there. A lot of my thoughts stem from an essay quite literally titled "What is Strategy?" By Michael Porter. It's an essay that makes the rounds in your business schools, but it's an extremely important reading for anyone in business because it again forces you to make the distinction between strategy and say what is often confused with strategy in terms of operational excellence or operational effectiveness. And these two things often get confused, but they're very different, right? And so I'd start there. But in big picture, for me, strategy is equivalent to the trade-offs that as a company we decide to take in order to then pursue a strategic advantage, right, in business. So
when you don't really understand the distinction, it's almost like people can be very tactical with the way that they do business. So what I mean by that is not really thinking about the long-term plan, but just acting at the heat of things. So for example, looking at what other people are doing in your industry and thinking that that's what you should be doing. And so when you switch really quickly between objectives, you kind of lose the long-term plan. So can you elaborate a little bit more on like how strategy gets implemented perhaps, and what is the principle of strategy in the first place?
Yeah, that's an important thing. So in my case, I'm obviously coming at it from the perspective of where Integrated Projects is and how we see strategic positioning. But I'm convinced that this applies really to anyone in business. But before getting into specifically what we do, I think one of the case studies that have impacted me, and again is within the case study of what is strategy, is the case study of Southwest Airlines and how their origin story and how they came to be. And to try to make it relevant to your listeners and to folks within design, engineering, and construction, this is a really important case study because Take, for example, this case study. Southwest Airlines, when it started, it was in the 1970s. It was a young company, and it tried to compete in a much larger existing competitive landscape, a very established, large kind of corporate airlines, where the reality is it was very difficult to distinguish yourself from other large companies at the time, right? Because frankly, in addition to just having historically low margins as a business for airlines, it was just hard to compete and to differentiate yourself from, at the time, of course, Continental versus United versus all of these other airlines. Because ultimately, if you could just put people on a plane, keep them alive, and make them sure that they went from point A to point B, that was it, right? And it didn't really matter what the logo on the plane was. So it was very difficult to distinguish themselves. So even just competing in that marketplace was really difficult. So fast forward, Southwest, I think, had a really interesting way of understanding strategy, at least in order to break into like what is just a very competitive pond, right, where other players are. And what I'm fascinated by was they were very clear on what they didn't do, right? So what they didn't do is they didn't serve the existing population that could afford to travel on airplanes, right? So they actually went out and identified not the people that could afford to travel in the 1970s, which in those times were a little bit more business class, kind of the more well-to-do population. What Southwest actually identified was who are the people riding buses, right? Or who are the people that would otherwise have to drive to get to their destination, and how can we address their demand? Because it's just as much. It's not that people that can't afford Continental don't travel, it's just that they can't afford to travel, but they still need to. So being very clear with, okay, well, we're not addressing that market, we're addressing this market. That was the start of a series of trade-offs, right? From there, economically, they had to create an entire ecosystem of activities that made sense. So in other words, rather than spending a lot of money on creating planes that had first class, or that had stewards, or that had baggage checking, or that had automated, or I should say highly specified personnel to check your bag, rather than, offering very flexible flights from New York to LA, they actually had to do away with all of that and accept it as a trade-off and say, look, we're not actually going to do any of that. We're going to not offer first class. We're actually not going to allow you to check your bag. We're going to automate the ticketing system, so no, we're not paying staff there. We're actually going to only fly to second-tier cities, right? So rather than New York to Los Angeles, we're going to fly from a smaller tier city. And all of these trade-offs, right, being very clear with all of these, actually allowed them to provide an amazing service at the time that captured an entire demand that just wasn't even serviced in the first place, right? And so they were able to achieve that, and they were able to appeal to a very specific market that just wasn't being spoken to or even serviced. What is more interesting, though, is then when people caught on to that, or not people, but organizations, competitors caught on to that, and they tried to emulate Southwest. And here's where it gets interesting, because at the time, of course, the Continental Airlines was one of the larger airlines at the time. And in response to the success that Southwest had, they tried to compete by creating an entirely new line called Continental Light. And this Continental Light was essentially a direct competition with Southwest to offer, lower priced fare, more affordable travel. They failed miserably. And I think it's important to understand why they failed and why Southwest succeeded. And it was because at the time, Continental Light didn't accept the concept of trade-offs. In other words, they were straddling two different strategic positions, where Continental still had the very large, expensive jumbo jets. They still had to maintain the overhead and staff of, you know, a full service airline, first class, everyone got meals, etc. And they tried to do this low fare thing. There was no trade-offs. They essentially tried to do it all, and then of course failed miserably. And so to relate this back to design, engineering, construction, service-based industries, we're not any different. We have to have the same understanding of trade-offs to be able to compete sustainably, right, as a company. In our case, right, we have to be very clear with who we service, who we're going to provide an exceptional level of service, and who we're just not going to be able to do it. And that's okay, right? There's room in the market to service various folks, but we have to be very clear with what we don't do, right, to allow us to then provide an amazing service for the people that we will. I'll stop there, but that's kind of at the heart of how I understand strategy. You know, and then it does lead to a series of other decisions from an operations perspective as to what you decide to focus on.
Yeah, indeed. You know, it reminds me of something we say in Poland, that if you're trying to be good with everything, you're good for nothing. And I think that in business, it's really important to have like a clear message and to know, like, to define very clearly why you're doing something and who you're serving, and to really align your service and the price as well as the message towards the specific customer. So I know that when you have referred to certain strategies that need to be put in place and thought of in order to really strategically position your business, you're talking about answering those questions, but can you elaborate a little bit more on it? And also I'm curious about, you know, what really drove you to take those steps and decide those particular steps for integrated projects?
Yeah. So some of the specific steps we had to take was taking a pause and asking ourselves where the design industry is, where demand is, where clients are, and just the general needs. And often a lot of those answers came outside of the immediate sphere of the design industry, right? You have to look at other industries to learn what's happening and take notes, right? So that's where it starts. I think in terms of specific steps that we've had to take, we've had to implement a series of steps. And this is something I've spoken about before, where I'm convinced that regardless if you're a large company or a small company, the series of activities, right, that a company decides to perform is their strategy, right? And so I would start there with what are the exact activities that you're choosing to work on, and what are you choosing to not work on. That's the start. You have to get that really right, because that is much harder to emulate. Now, going back to strategy versus operational effectiveness. Operational effectiveness, or what's called, you know, sometimes referred to as operational excellence, is being very clear with what you do and then getting really a lot better at that, right? And that is a function of just trying to consistently improve, consistently remain lean and get better, quicker, cheaper. That's every company needs to do that, right? However, that's not strategy. That is operational effectiveness. And the distinction is really important, because you can get better, quicker, cheaper, understanding that that's, with that alone, it's always going to be a race to the bottom. And throughout history, there's many examples of us essentially competing, different companies competing, and it's going to be consistently a race to the bottom of who's better, quicker, cheaper, and then ultimately driving down profits and whatnot, right? So what you want to also do, in addition to operational excellence, of always, of course, improving your own operations, is making sure that you are creating an entirely new playground, I guess, for your company, right? Where you're not necessarily with, competing in what's called like a red ocean. The term red ocean is just simply a term reference in like companies that there's just a lot of competition, and quite literally there's a lot of blood in the water, and quite literally it's just a race to the bottom, right? As opposed to a blue ocean, right, where there's not many competitors. It's less defined, but by definition, there's less competition and thus much more room to grow. So you always want to try to position your company as much as possible within a blue ocean instead of a red ocean, first and foremost. And so that's obviously what we're trying to do, as I'm sure every design firm needs to do. There is this kind of cliche where architects tend to be like the kind of the jack of all trades, and we just do everything. My experience in academia has always been, how can you become a very good conceptual thinker to solve any kind of problem, which is an amazing skill to have. But in business, you need to be super, super focused, right? You need to like address a thing and do it really well. And so I think that it's important to balance the two. In our case, we are servicing the commercial sector. We started our early kind of gateway into some of the early work was specifically within office spaces, and then specifically within the market of the flexible office space, which until very recently was a very high growth market. And what I mean by like flexible office space, I mean the kind of the new trend of co-working, flexible office space providers, the kind of the high growth providers. We chose that market because at the time it was the fastest moving vehicle for us to be able to prove out our thesis of being able to digitize space very quickly. And then once you digitize space, all of the value add services that come after that is what we were working on. I think there's decisions on what you choose to work on. I think things like pricing models, and I think we briefly talked about this before, is something to keep in mind. And again, just one more lever, right, of many levers that I think a company has to be very clear on. And each lever has to kind of complement the next, right? Because you can imagine that while any company may be able to copy one or two levers, right, or two combinations of things, it's very, very difficult for any company, small or large, to be able to copy every single combination of levers, right? And so that's goes back to, again, the activities that a company decides to do or not to do. Yeah, and maybe in another video, I'll talk about it specifically. I think some of the more granular things that we decide to do with how we're implementing, 3D scanning technology with BIM, with data science, with front end and back end platforms, etc. But yeah, every company has to kind of have their own series of activities to be able to provide the best value for their clients. So.
Very much so. Those activities are a little bit of a combination of what your skill set is and your interest, with the concept of blue ocean, which very much refers in reality to the needs of the customer as well. So there's this thin line behind how you make a decision, really trying to position your product in front of a niche and a customer that will find value in it, and with a narrow message, right? So I think that's for a lot of people that perhaps don't have much of a big business background, or for that, for the means of specifically the example of red ocean and blue ocean marketing background. How would you define really for, let's just say, an architecture firm, what a blue ocean would be? Like, let's just say, what specifically would you need to think about to move from a red ocean idea to a blue ocean idea?
Yeah, this is tough. And if it was an easy answer, believe me, there would be many more people shifting over to a blue ocean. So I don't pretend that, this is obviously my perspective, tons of other ideas. I think to be able to kind of describe how I think about it, again, I would have to use a parallel or a metaphor. one of, I think, the more successful cases of a blue ocean way of executing is historically, I think Henry Ford was a great example of a blue ocean that he created, right, with the Model T car and the market that he created, an entirely new market that he created, right, by doing so. And so, you know, when Henry Ford started the Model T car, we were in a very different place with transportation technology. Cars existed before the Model T, but they were very expensive and they were very custom, and only in this case the elite could afford them, right? In fact, at the time, the U.S. president said that nothing signifies the level of arrogance and wealth than essentially the car, the automobile, right? So there was a sentiment, you know, back in the, I think, 1900s and 1910s, that this particular thing, cars were understood very differently then than they are now. And so what I thought was interesting was Henry Ford at the time didn't necessarily look to compete with the very expensive custom tailor-made cars, but rather chose to actually look at a completely different thing, right? And again, going back to your question about how do you begin looking at a blue ocean, you usually have to begin by not looking at the competition. You usually have to begin with where is the world? And the reality is, at the time, most of the world was actually not on a car, but it was actually on horse and buggy, right? And so I think in his creation of trying to create a blue ocean for Ford, he looked at the horse and buggy. So first and foremost, I think it's really important to understand what benchmarks are you looking at? And it's usually not a good idea to look at your competition or what you assume to be your direct competition. The answer is usually somewhere else. And so in his case, it was a horse and buggy, and it was drastically different because it was much more common. Many more people could attain it. The price point was obviously very, very different, but it had, you know, certain pros and cons about it, right? A horse and buggy was not able to kind of adjust for the bumpy roads of the time, right? Most of the roads at that time were dirt. It was certainly less expensive, and I guess the con of the very expensive tailored vehicles at the time were that in order to service it, and if something messed up, it was very, very expensive. So like when you put all these things together, what he was able to do was actually reverse engineer a product that was not looking at the expensive vehicles. In fact, he didn't even use that as a benchmark. He used actually the price point of a horse and buggy and worked backwards of how can I create a car that doesn't compete with the tailor-made, but actually with a horse and buggy. So sure enough, he actually worked from there and worked his way backwards. And sure enough, you know, most people know the story of Henry Ford and the Model T and the assembly line and things like that. But it's an example of how you even begin to ask the question of, maybe it just starts with asking a different question or looking at a different set of factors. And I think for designers, engineers, we've probably been so accustomed to looking within our own realm and what people are doing within our own sector that we forget that there's entirely other industries that we can learn from. In my case, I'm convinced that we need to be learning a lot more from just the SaaS technology sector. We have a lot to learn there in a lot of ways. But yeah, I'll stop there. But I think that's how you can even begin to identify an opportunity, a blue ocean opportunity for your own individual firm.
Sure, it's a really interesting insight, and one of the things that I'm kind of hearing is that one of the important aspects is obviously to not look at the competition but look at opportunities, and I think that those opportunities a lot of times present themselves as problems. So in the example that you've spoken of, there was definitely a problem that Ford has fixed, and when you really fix a problem for someone, then the value of what you're providing grows, and with that also the customer base. So I think it's really important to see it that way also. And just as a side note, because I heard you speak about how you decided to kind of narrow down your services to flexible office buildings and things like that. Recently, I started working with a team of like trend researchers, and there's been quite an interesting piece of information that we came across that could be quite an interesting thing also to kind of maybe discuss here, related to what you do, but also the concept of like blue ocean and how you can navigate through information to kind of narrow down your message as well as provide services. We've been looking into ways in which architecture will change post COVID-19, and what will the world look like? Because one of the things, let's admit, that we're not quite seeing and experiencing yet is the real outcome of COVID. Like, we're sitting at home and we're disconnected from the everyday life. So, we yet are to really see the changes that will come. And it might be that we'll go back to work and realize that our favorite coffee place went down, and the favorite barista serving you coffee is no longer there. Or perhaps some people from the offices will not come back to work, and you'll never really understand why. Maybe they changed their mind, or perhaps they found a different work, or maybe they were fired. And so these changes are still to be really experienced. And one of the things is that, looking at statistics, specifically in the United States, there is actually quite a lot of people that already lost their jobs in architecture, and a lot of projects for architects were pulled out. So there is, no continuation, and it's all now statistically measured. And those statistics are a little bit shocking because numbers are already big. And so one is wondering what's going to happen next. And I think that seeing what's on people's minds and the subjects being talked about, a lot of people are thinking about, first of all, definitely transforming digital and becoming less dependent on the economy, on employers, on big firms, whatever, because even the very big corporations have proven that some people were disposable very easy in the process. And so that's saddening to see that no matter your financial status or even your skill set, you can be disposable in a situation of a kind of economic turmoil. But we've been looking into specifically how offices will change, and considering that a lot of people might decide to start their own businesses, there definitely is going to be quite a boom. I mean, that's hypothetical, but it's interesting to think about it, that there will be a boom for actually flexible social spaces and places where, for office buildings. And then we started thinking about, what happened with, for example, the crash in 2008. And we were discussing, what if, what happened was a lot of real estate was unfinished and undone, and a lot of projects kind of didn't quite complete. So architecture in one way went to pose and created this kind of empty buildings that never got completed because the companies either bankrupted or something. But then, there is a potential there'll be a bigger need for office buildings. So how can those two things combine? And we're just envisioning these ways in which like co-working spaces will take over the unfinished buildings in big cities and perhaps develop there. And what would that really mean for architects, and what would that mean for new business, startups, etc. And specifically when you're in New York, I live in Berlin. Well, not at the moment, but like full time I live there. And co-working is very popular in big cities. It's cheaper, and you get exposed to so many people that that you can potentially outsource other projects from or get ideas, and so the networking aspect of this is really strong. And I am for certain convinced that the blueprint of how we will do business and where we gather and how we gather will change. And it's interesting to speculate. And I think one of the actual factors of looking into red ocean and blue ocean is also looking into this hypothetical scenarios and seeing is there a potential for me to step in and perhaps offer something that would be completely unique to my competition, and using that opportunity and being driven by this message. Is there a problem I could solve with this, so that my message can narrow down, and my business can also, like you were speaking before, how important it is to have like a focused message, and that's a strategic positioning, really. So it kind of combines with this idea of like looking at opportunities and asking yourself, can I solve a problem?
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. 100%. I, you're asking all the right questions. What I'm wondering is, while we probably won't be able to know or be able to tell the future, I think what we will be able to do is to identify some of those big macro trends. And you're right, I don't see us going away from a shared working environment, but I think that the definition of that is going to evolve, right? So, especially amidst what's going on with COVID-19, we're realizing that we don't physically have to be in a space all the time, right? With that said, the pendulum goes both ways, right? Too much remote work, I think, is obviously we're going to feel the effects now, right, as we're all staying at home for much longer than we anticipated. And yeah, I think the nature of work, I think, is going to change. The nature of physical work versus remote work is going to change. What you mentioned about digitizing of work and everything that that means. I think so all of these trends are very much important to keep in mind. And yeah, and I think that's the best we can do, is to try to just be students of, you know, what people are needing. And you just try to consistently, try to consistently provide value there. So it's exciting times ahead. And I think for every company, there's certainly room to create your own blue ocean. And there's so many different ways. I'm actually curious to hear a little bit more about what you have in mind, but yeah, I mean, in terms of how you're positioning yourself and what stories you're telling that maybe you're not hearing from others.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been really insightful. And I think that a lot of people and a lot of companies right now, especially in the sector of design, need to truly go back to the whiteboard and ask themselves those basic questions. And it really is very much down to those simple strategies that you can implement today in order to first of all help your business survive if it's threatened, but also to allow it to thrive through these times. Because I've shared today on my social media also an article, I don't know if you've seen, about how MoMA's basically been like letting all the educators and trainers off, and they just have decided that digital transformation is not for them, or perhaps not thinking about it. But for me, it's very saddening because it's one of like the highest budgeted museums that can actually have the budget to provide digital education and move their services virtual. And I mean, this week alone, I've done so many virtual events and things. I've watched my favorite drag queens perform, and I've been watching some incredible architecture movies that have not been actually legally quite accessible before. So there's been quite a lot of libraries and companies and that have opened up their resources to people today, knowing that we spend more time online and that we're looking for entertainment and we're looking for perhaps more knowledge, education, etc. And looking at big gallery like MoMA and seeing how they haven't adapted, and instead they're actually going down under with the resources and the financial resources that they have. It's saddening, and I think it's really important to be able to understand the importance of like thinking about what I'm doing, who I'm serving, how am I positioning myself, so that in this time you can even refine your message more.
Yeah. And to your credit, you're ahead of that. So I think a lot of the conversations you're having, I'm excited to hear more of how who you're meeting and what various folks are doing. But yeah, I appreciate you having me. If obviously, if there's any listeners that kind of resonate with the message, obviously they should reach out to you to hear what they're out to. And yeah, if there's any like owners or operators in this space, we obviously would love to talk to you, so feel free to reach out.
Exactly, and it's great. Thank you so much for giving the listeners this opportunity, because honestly, you know, I think it's important also to not only learn from other people, but to be able to talk and have that element of accessibility. So it's great that you're available, and yeah, I encourage anybody who does want to ask questions to reach out.
Awesome. Awesome.
So thank you so much, Jose, for yet another amazing conversation. I wish you all the best, and I hope we connect soon again.
Thank you so much. Talk soon.
Thank you. Take care. Ciao.